Excuse me, this is the worst thing you have to do. Because my wife and I were having a function, and I'm going to turn this off. Anyway, I'm sorry. But she said, it sounds like one of the things that really the reason you wrote this book is that it's a form of closure for you. And you know something, ladies and gentlemen, I really do think as I reflect on why I wrote the book, it really was a form of closure for me. It's something I had in my system to do, and I'm glad I did it. And I hopefully it will help all of you for me to share what I've learned. So the book covers a number of things. It covers my time as Deputy Attorney General, national security issues. I dealt with white-collar crime, corporate fraud, prosecutions. I was the oversight prosecutor for Enron. You all remember the Enron corporate scandal, WorldCom, Adelphia. Those are all the cases that I oversaw as a Deputy Attorney General. It also covers corporate culture, my time at Volkswagen, my time advising corporations when I was in private practice about the importance of corporate culture and how companies can be more successful with the right kind of positive corporate culture. I talk about the book and my experience at PepsiCo and talk about corporate governance issues and how corporations can be better citizens and how corporate governance is a very important aspect to life in our country and how corporations need to move away from running the companies, especially public companies, on a 90-day cycle. You run the business so you can report short-term profits in 90 days, and every day is the same thing. And I talk about diversity. We saw yesterday that President Trump killed all government DEI initiatives, and many corporations have gone along with that. And I talk about this issue in the book. I talk about violent crime in the book because I've had a great deal of experience in dealing with that when I was a young prosecutor in Atlanta. President Reagan appointed me to be the U.S. Attorney in Atlanta when I was 38 years old. And from that time, I've had a great deal of experience in violent crime. And then finally, I talk about just some observations that I think all of us would find useful about life in general and what I see on a going forward basis for our great country. And so what I'd like to do this afternoon, I haven't done it quite this way before because this is my first formal bookstore book event. I've had some book events before, but this is the first time in an actual real bookstore. So what I thought I would do was talk a little bit about some of my experiences, begin with some of my experiences as the Deputy Attorney General, and maybe read you a section of the book in which I discuss some of the things that I dealt with, and I'll talk about those experiences, and then I'll read a section, given what's happened today, at the end of the book, which will sort of summarize my concerns after 51 years of practicing law, my concerns about our country and my optimism about our great country too. So what I'll do is sort of cover those things and hopefully leave enough time for you all to ask me questions. I think you'll have plenty of questions to ask me, knowing what I know about Sarasota and all the bright artsy people here. So I'm sure I'll get plenty of questions. So the Deputy Attorney General position, as Georgia mentioned, it's really the chief operating officer of the Department of Justice. The Department of Justice is a huge institution. It includes the 94 different United States attorneys' offices. I think this district is in the Middle District of Florida, with the U.S. Attorney's Office based in Tampa, I believe. You're the chief operating officer, and it was perhaps, of all the things I've done, the most difficult and searing job of my experience. And the reason is I was on duty in 9/11, 2001, when our country got hit. So let me talk a little bit about that. I was sworn in in May of 2001. I had previously just been a domestic lawyer. I'd been involved in domestic issues, no experience in national security issues, but as the Deputy Attorney General, I had to attend the national security meetings of all the deputies, of the principals. And that's where the work of the National Security Council is done, at the deputies committee level. And during these meetings, especially around July of 2001, I began to get briefings on what the intelligence professionals call noise in the system. And what that means is that there are imminent and dangerous threats to the United States or United States interest around the world. And these threats that I was getting briefings on were threats from radical Islam terrorists who were hell-bent on attacking American interest around the world. No one thought that we were going to get hit on the homeland, but we clearly knew that something was going to happen, and these terrorists were trying like crazy to hit and hurt Americans and kill Americans. I shouldn't even try to clean it up. They were trying to kill Americans. So that was my first introduction to national security issues. I had two very good men working underneath me, Michael Chertoff, who went on to become the Secretary of Health and, the Secretary of Homeland Security, and David Criss, who was a very, very knowledgeable national security professional who became the very first Assistant Attorney General of the newly minted National Security Division. But they were working for me in the summer of '01. And Michael and David came to me and said, "We have a problem, Larry. Our intelligence agents and our law enforcement agents, especially in the FBI, are not talking to each other. And moreover, they're not talking to our lawyers in the criminal division. And we are afraid that this really, given all the intelligence that we are receiving, this puts the United States at a disadvantage. We couldn't connect the dots. They were not talking to each other." And I didn't really know what to do about that, because the reason that they were not talking to each other was justified, because we had a wall between intelligence and law enforcement, because there was a misuse of intelligence information previously in terms of identifying Americans and subverting our own constitutional rights. If the government wants to exercise a wiretap on me, the government agents need to go to a United States district magistrate judge, show probable cause to do so, and then get a warrant for that. And you didn't have to do that if you were using intelligence information. And so there was a great misuse of intelligence information. You remember Dr. Martin Luther King was wiretapped extensively by the FBI, but the FBI never got a warrant to wiretap Dr. King. And the reason they were able to wiretap him is that they said he was a foreign agent, and they were using intelligence as a predicate for wiretapping Dr. King. So the wall between intelligence and law enforcement was justified from a civil liberties standpoint, but it had kind of had gone too far, given the threats that we were faced. And so in the middle of August, after a great deal of deliberation on my team and within the Department of Justice, and I talked to my boss, Attorney General John Ashcroft, I decided to write a memo to the FBI and all Department of Justice personnel. I had no authority over intelligence agents in the CIA or other parts of the government, but I wrote this to the intelligence and law enforcement agents in the Department of Justice that they needed to talk to each other. And anytime there was intelligence information that could possibly lead to a violation of the law, they had to share that with the attorneys in the criminal division, and we would be able to talk to each other, and perhaps solve the problem in a better way. So that memo went out in middle August 2001. And think about that from the timeline. Middle August of 2001. What happened at 9/11? 3,000 Americans were murdered. I call it a mass murder, the largest mass murder in the history of our country. And let me just read to you a section of the book that I wrote in terms of describing the angst that I experienced then, and quite frankly, the angst that I experience now with respect to what happened. 2 decades later, I can only acknowledge that I've never been able to answer those questions to my satisfaction. Those questions as to whether or not I did enough. Could I have been more aggressive? Could I have been more specific? Could I have acted more quickly to prevent what happened at 9/11? I'm far from convinced that even had the wall been deconstructed entirely a month earlier, authorities would have been able to head off the attack. Nor am I sure I would have been able to pull off a more drastic change in the guidance before the horrors that befell our nation. Resistance from many in the civil liberties community would have been fierce. As it was, Judge Royce Lamberth, sitting at the time as the chief judge of the FISA court, properly called me to inquire about the nature of the memo. But that does not mean that I'm not still heartsick and profoundly troubled by the outcome. There may be nothing more I feasibly could have done, but I still wish I had done more. And I'll admit that in the years that immediately followed the attacks, my anguish spurred me to seek professional help for the one and only time in my decades-long career. I'm not ashamed to talk about this fact. Making this public has, in fact, been cathartic for me. So this makes it a little bit more difficult when you share something personal with your neighbors, because I hadn't discussed this any time before I started to write this book. My internist knew that I was in trouble, and he sent me to a person to deal with the depression that I experienced, and it made life difficult for me. Brenda was great, but it's something that I had to deal with, and it's what's so satisfying in another sense is that I've done several of these talks, and people invariably say to me, "Thank you for talking about this. I've experienced this in my life, or my spouse has experienced this, or my child has experienced this." And so this is something I think that has been good for me. At least it's been very cathartic for me to talk about this after all these years. And hopefully, writing about this and discussing this out in the open will serve some positive benefit in terms of understanding of mental health. And let me go on to read another part of that, which deals with another aspect of my experience as the Deputy Attorney General, and that is in large part why this topic remains so difficult now. In this realm of the law, where applying the norms established in the world of criminal justice can leave the nation vulnerable to attack, and where applying the standards that frame intelligence operation can undermine cherished civil liberties, the question is ultimately about balance. People of goodwill can argue over the trade-offs. Likely there's no perfect solution. But today, a full 20 years after the worst terrorist attack ever committed on American soil, in fact, an act of mass murder, I believe our government needs, once again, to review the incumbent regime. While I hope nothing will ever rise to the level of angst that defines my view of those critical months before 9/11, this issue too keeps me up at night. So we haven't gotten over this. And you think about what happened recently in New Orleans and what happened in Las Vegas. Our nation is still subject to terrorist attacks. Our nation is subject to terrorist attacks by foreign individuals and by domestic citizens. And I have in the book a hypothetical, and I'll just mention this hypothetical to you, and we can see what I'm talking about. You're a government official, you're a senior government official, and you get word that there's a bomb under FedEx Stadium in Washington, D.C., where the Washington Commanders play. It used to be called the Washington Redskins, where they play. And you get word about 11 a.m. The bomb is scheduled to go off sometimes between 6 p.m. and 8 p.m. That's all you have, except there is one person in the United States who is a foreign national, but who is here legally. There's one person who may have information on this terrible event. But you don't have time to get an arrest warrant. In fact, you can't even get an arrest warrant if all the information you have is intelligence. Intelligence information does not stand up to the constitutional standards of a warrant. So you can't do that. And even if you could, you have to read him his Miranda rights and offer him a public defender. You've got a short time frame. If you want to interrogate this person, and that's what you need to do many times, it's just simply interrogate somebody, but there's no predicate for it, then you can say, well, I'll authorize the FBI to take this guy off the street, instruct them that there's no rough stuff, but take him to a Holiday Inn and interrogate him. But if you do that, and it blows up in your face that nothing was happening, and then he knows who did this, this possibly could subject you to a civil lawsuit. You could be charged with false arrest. You may have to pay huge amounts of money in civil damages. You would certainly be fired from the government. What do you do as a senior government official? And one of the things I talk about in this book, and I'm really glad I wrote the book, is to call attention to the fact that there's a balance. There's a balance between civil liberties and law enforcement. I tended, especially after 9/11, to err on the side of law enforcement. That's where I erred. But you always had to have a balance. And what do you do? I think, and by the way, I do not want to give the government a blank check to deal with these things. I really don't want that to happen. And so I think we need to consider all the vagaries of the national security web of different possibilities, and we need to have a national security court that would consist of federally appointed and cleared judges, like the FISA court has. It would have cleared defense lawyers, and it would not have to meet all the time, but on those rare occasions where you may need to interrogate someone, you may need to send someone in a rendition who's in the United States, you need to send them out of the country right away. I think we need to have a national security court that will help protect our civil liberties, but also will help protect the men and women who are senior national security government officials from the very difficult decisions they have to make. And you certainly don't want somebody afraid to do something and then a whole bunch of people are killed and murdered, but you don't want to subject someone to unnecessary expense and civil liberties. I write in the book about a case I had where John Ashcroft, my boss, was out of the country, and this is what I can say about the case from the record. A fellow was transiting through the United States to Montreal. He was an Al-Qaeda, had Al-Qaeda involvement, and my job was what do we do with this guy? He was a dual Canadian-Syrian citizen. I could let him go on to Montreal. He'd be in Canada. You know what the borders are like between the United States and Canada, especially someone with an Al-Qaeda background. I could also send him to Syria, where he might be tortured. And there is a law on the books called the anti-torture statute. And if you knowingly violate that statute as a government official, it's a criminal penalty. And I could be subject to prosecution, certainly investigation. I had left the government, by the way, after all this stuff blew up. I made this decision while I was Deputy Attorney General. And he claimed, after I'd left government, that he was tortured in Syria. There was an outcry by the civil libertarians about what I'd done. Congressman Conyers from Michigan had called for a special prosecutor to be appointed to investigate me and possibly put me in jail. The government decided it would represent me in the civil proceeding. It was a Bivens case, Robin, were accusing me of civil violations of this man's rights. And the government said, we will represent you. And I was happy because that's going to save me a lot of money. But all of a sudden, the FBI agents started to call me and they wanted to interview Mr. Thompson. And prior to that, they said, you know, Mr. Thompson, that you're the subject of a criminal investigation. Well, you know, my mother didn't raise a fool, as I say, and I'm not, and I wouldn't advise any of you, I'm not going to talk to an FBI agent who tells me I'm a subject of a criminal investigation without a lawyer present. But the government wouldn't pay for the lawyer. And so long after I'd left government, I had to hire lawyers to represent me in a legal matter. And they gave me the friends and family rate, by the way. But at the end of the day, I had to pay something like $27,000 out of my own pocket for legal fees that I incurred in connection with this case. The case went up to the Second Circuit Court of Appeals, and I prevailed, but it wasn't unanimous. It was not a unanimous decision. So this is the kind of thing that we are facing today as I'm talking to you here in Sarasota. And so hopefully people that read this book will understand these policy issues, and hopefully it will have a positive effect. And I want to just briefly mention the other side of my responsibilities, and that was the head of the corporate fraud task force. You recall all of those corporate scandals, and a lot of people were concerned about our economy with the face of these corporate scandals. And I was working very closely with Bob Mueller. You remember Bob Mueller, the director of the FBI, and we really took a very vigorous and tough approach to these corporate crimes. And we didn't take the typical approach where you just send a subpoena to the corporation and they review the documents and send you back the documents. And I mean, we took a more aggressive but proper approach to investigating and possibly prosecuting these crimes. Some people didn't like what we were doing and thought we were unnecessarily demonizing business interest. And I remember Alberto Gonzalez, who was President Bush's White House counsel, giving me a call one day and said, Larry, I'm sorry to give you this information, but the president wants to see you and Bob Mueller tomorrow. And there's going to be a meeting in the Roosevelt room. Okay, nobody really likes to get a call like that in the government. And so Bob and I talked to each other on the phone. What are we going to say? And we didn't really want to go through the abstract justifications as to why we were using the task force method, why we were using the things we were doing from a law enforcement standpoint. We just didn't think that would stick. And we then decided that we're going to give the president some examples of the kinds of things that we were investigating. So the next day we drive over to the White House, we go into the Roosevelt room, and there's this big table, and there's a water and pencils for Bob and me on one side of the table, and all the other people on the other side of the table, including President Bush. So President Bush talks to us about some chit chat, and then asks us to explain kind of what we're doing with these corporate fraud prosecutions. And then Bob and I told him about some clear examples of what we were investigating, where one executive had lied to his outside auditor from a major accounting firm, how another executive had made blatant misrepresentations during an earnings call, public call to his investors. And I could see the President Bush stiffen up when we were telling him these examples. And he was actually beginning to turn a little red. He was really serious and stern. And so he turned to the gentleman to his side, I'm not going to mention who he was, and turned to him and looked at him and said, "We can't let people get away with this, can we?" And then he called me LT sometimes, and he called Bob Bobby. And then he says, "LT, Bobby, thank you for what you're doing, and keep up the good work." So I always fondly remember that, because the president clearly understood that what was going on was unacceptable, and he was not afraid to take the consequences of going aggressive on some very powerful people in our country, some very powerful and wealthy people and institutions in our country. And so in today's world, where we see, again, lots of involvement by powerful, wealthy businessmen and women, we hope that if they do get involved in criminal activity, our government will again take a vigorous approach to dealing with these. I think it's a moral hazard if we deal with wealthy and powerful individuals in a different way than we deal with people who are dealing in drugs or stealing cars. We gotta deal with violations of crime the same way. I personally consider it a moral hazard if we have a two-tiered criminal justice system. So I'm gonna stop pretty soon here and allow questions, but I would like to just get to given what's happened today and yesterday in terms of where we are with some of the actions that President Trump took, I'd like to just kind of read to you something from my book toward the end of the book. This is toward the end. As I write these words, I'm struck and saddened by the state of American society at this moment. I was floored when I read the following in the August 13, 2021 edition of the Wall Street Journal. And I have quotation marks from what was in the journal. "We're in a moment in which there's incredible disagreement about whether democracy is a good idea in the first place, what a good democracy looks like, what civility looks like, and what truth looks like. We seem to be losing a sense of common ground, common purpose, and even common facts. Despite what former Attorney General of the United States, Bill Barr, said, and despite what high-ranking officials from the FBI and Department of Homeland Security said, and despite the rulings of many Republican-appointed federal judges, many Americans still believe there was widespread fraud in the 2020 election. In fact, this view continues to be promulgated by former President Trump without much pushback from members of his own political party." And then toward the end, I sort of reflect a sense of optimism as to where we're going from that quote, which is kind of a dark quote. So at the end of this work about my life in the law, I want to conclude on a point that centers on the realities we all face outside of it. Shortly after I became Deputy Attorney General, I had lunch with a young Justice Department lawyer who told me that we really do not need to be of one mind all the time, as long as we are of one purpose. I found this profound. To me, that one purpose is understanding each other through civility, and I believe, notwithstanding our considerable differences, that there is a strong fabric in American society that will ultimately hold us together. And I do believe that. So we'll have to see. And we'll have to see if we can continue to follow what Justice Jackson said to us many years ago, and that is, it's our job to hold the government accountable for what it does. And we really need to be vigilant as we do that. So I'll be happy to try to answer any questions. Robin.
Larry, could I remind you, though, you'd asked me to remind you to talk about
Yes.
the editorial in the New York Times.
Yes, thank you.
Yeah.
And I was reading in the Sarasota Rich this morning, the New York Times. And you remember I mentioned Judge Royce Lambert, who called me in August of 2001. Well, he's still on the bench. He's a senior judge now, and he is no longer head of the FISA court, but he's a senior judge, and he has had to be the judge on some of these January 6 cases. And last week, one of the defendants in the January 6 case, after he had been convicted by a jury, went to Judge Lambert and said, President Trump has said he's going to pardon me. Will you postpone my sentence? Will you postpone implementing the sentence that you gave? In other words, don't let me go to jail. And this is what Judge Lambert, who was appointed, I believe, by Reagan. In fact, I know he was appointed by Reagan because he's a Republican, and I think is too old to have been appointed by Carter. He says, I have been dismayed to see distortions and outright falsehoods seep into the public consciousness. I have been shocked to watch some public figures try to rewrite history, claiming rioters behaved in an orderly fashion like ordinary tourists, or martyrizing convicted January 6 defendants as political prisoners, or even incredibly hostages. That is all preposterous. But the court fears that such destructive, misguided rhetoric could presage further danger to our country. And that was just what he said last week. I think Judge Lambert would have still agreed with me in terms of the fabric of our society. And before I answer your question, Robin, I belong to an organization called NAFUSA. What does that mean? National Association of Former United States Attorneys. And I recently was at a convention of NAFUSA in San Diego. And remember, all United States attorneys are political animals. They're appointed in a political process. They're confirmed by the United States Senate. There are 94 United States attorneys. And you go out there and you're part of the Reagan U.S. attorney group, or the Carter, not many Carters left, but there's some. By the way, the last time in San Diego, there was a gentleman from the Johnson administration. Can you believe that? He was appointed by Lyndon Johnson. But the point is, every single man and woman who's a member of that organization has great fidelity to the rule of law, whether they were appointed by Bill Clinton, or in my case, Ronald Reagan, or there were a number of Trump U.S. attorneys out there in the first term. And they all, there was not a single light between us in terms of a sense of purpose and fidelity to the rule of law, belief in prosecutions that are free from political or improper influence. That's the common purpose that I think we still have as a country. And it's going to be up to us to make certain that our elected leaders adhere to that common purpose. Okay, Robin.
Thank you for writing this book, and thank you for being the kind of public servant who makes Justice Jackson's distinction meaningful. If we don't have public servants who recognize their duty to hold up the rule of law and to protect civil liberties and the Constitution, then we are babes in the wilderness. So thank you for that. But I have two difficult questions to ask. One about 9/11 and about why our Saudi Arabian neighbors in this region were part of the conspiracy, assisting participants in the slaughter to train and to have support were allowed to get away and there was no follow-up
Yes.
on investigating. And the second question relates to the fate of Arthur Anderson. You know, sure, there were really bad apples in that organization, but killing the whole organization, which included very good people,
Absolutely.
some of whom were close friends of mine, at the highest level, you know, what was did damage
Yes.
to the resources for the United States, for, you know, the global corporate system and so on.
Let me answer the latter question first. And the Arthur Anderson, this prosecution was perhaps one of the reasons Bob and I were summoned over to President Bush's office. But as I write about in the book, no one wanted to indict Arthur Anderson. I did not want to indict Arthur Anderson. The case was being led by Mike Chertoff, who was the head of the criminal division at the time. And we offered Arthur Anderson every way out possibly that we could offer them. They were under 2 civil consent decrees for doing some of the same things that they did in Enron, including document destruction. These were civil consent decrees. They said that they did not want to resolve this matter in the criminal arena. I would have been glad if they had taken a deferred prosecution agreement where they would have been allowed to remain doing whatever they're doing. The prosecution is set aside and it's deferred as long as they fulfill the terms of the agreement, and then a judge dismisses the prosecution that's sort of hanging over their heads. They didn't want to do that. KPMG, which is I don't know if anybody here is associated with KPMG, but it's a viable accounting firm, national accounting firm today. Shortly after that, took a deferred prosecution agreement involving some illegal tax shelters that they were selling. So, Robin, you're absolutely right. It was a very tough decision. It has made the government very cautious, I think too cautious, with respect to how to deal with corporate fraud. And I know we're in a sort of a financial institution area here, but if you read the civil plea agreements in the bank fraud cases that were settled at the end of the Obama administration, where these banks paid hundreds and hundreds of millions of dollars, but not a single executive was criminally prosecuted. I read those agreements, and the banks admit to doing all kinds of bad, deceptive, fraudulent things. But if I made that kind of misrepresentation on a loan application to a bank, I would be subject to going to jail. And if you made that kind of misrepresentation, you would be subject to going to jail. So, yeah, it was a tough decision, and I write about that in the book. What I don't write about in the book, because I wrote about the Saudi Arabia thing, and maybe one of the reviews I got on my book was, oh, he's got a good discussion on things, but I think he's holding back. This is what one of the reviewers said, George. Maybe I was. But so right after 9/11, we being the government, we were arresting a number of individuals who had connections with the 19 terrorists, the dead men. We found evidence in their apartments of certain people. We found evidence through friends that they had, and the government proceeded to either arrest or indict some of the people that were associated with the 19 dead men. And guess what? Almost all of them, number one, were Saudis. Not all, but almost all. But all of them had basically the same law firm show up to represent them. That's number one. And number two, we had no evidence that these men had ever called a lawyer. In other words, they hadn't sought counsel. The counsel knew they were in jail and showed up, and I'm representing so and so and so. Well, that's the way the mob operates, by the way. I'd had experience with organized crime cases in Atlanta, And that's the way the mob operates, because they want the same lawyers to represent people to keep them to shut up and not cooperate with the government. And so what we have in the federal criminal system, I hope I'm not getting too technical, but we call these Garcia hearings, where you have to have you have the lawyer and the potential putative client show up in court before a federal judge, and we ask a series of questions. Who are you representing, Mr. Lawyer? Who's paying you? All kinds of things. You ask the putative defendant, did you call this person? Are you satisfied with this person? And these are pretty tough hearings, and so many of the judges disqualified some of these lawyers from representing these men. Well, and this is why I didn't put in the book. I get a call. I'm the Deputy Attorney General. I get a call from Colin Powell. God bless him. Secretary of State. And he was very upset with me. He said, why are you doing this? The Saudis are our friends and we need them. And there was all kinds of stuff that I can't talk about that perhaps we did need them. They were doing a lot of things with us. Some of which I probably didn't know about. But at the same, I had my little responsibility, and it was clear from a legal standpoint, we had to hold these Garcia hearings. And if you know anything about the Department of Justice, the deputy is on the 4th floor, the Attorney General is on the 5th floor. I immediately went up to John's office and I said, I just got a call from Secretary of State, and this is what we're doing. And John says, you have to follow the law. We can't just roll over and let these lawyers, shut down the investigation. And so, I don't have a clear answer, Robin, but it's complicated. And I didn't put that in the book because I really didn't want to get Colin Powell's name involved. It was not. Yes, sir.
Mr. Thompson, preceding you, during the Clinton administration, the World Trade Center parking garage was bombed.
Yes.
Wasn't that enough notice that we had international terrorists at our doorstep among us?
I agree with you. Yeah.
And shouldn't that have been the wake-up call that we should have tightened up and invented the TSA and all these things instead of waiting for it? They were here.
Yeah.
We knew they were here. And the people who are much more intelligent and who are paid for our security, shouldn't they have been playing these war games and what ifs and knowing that they were coming back?
I don't know if you've had a chance to read the 9/11 Commission report.
I only read part of it.
But they discuss your exact point, and you're exactly right. All I can say is, in the context of what I went into in May of 2001, I'm not going to make necessarily a value judgment on it, but there was still a great concern on one hand about what you just said, and the ever-increasing threats the United States government was getting through intelligence. But there was also a concern about the civil liberties issues associated with too much coordination between intelligence and law enforcement. It was there. It was there. I was new to this, and maybe I should have, as I said in the book, maybe I should have acted earlier.
I'm not blaming you,
But I blame me.
But it was so ridiculous. I think we can all remember a time when you could get in a security line and it was specific to each individual airline.
Yes.
So if I was flying United, they had their own line, and at that time, box cutters, I was in the grocery business, were allowed.
Yes.
4-inch penknives were allowed.
Yeah.
And it doesn't take a creative mind to figure out that the doors are paper thin. I was dating a flight attendant, and everyone knew that the doors to the pilot were paper thin. These people who are entrusted for our security, why didn't they welcome that?
The only thing I can answer in terms of my book is, why aren't we considering a national security court now, after knowing what we know about what happened in New Orleans, knowing what we know about what happened in Las Vegas, knowing what we know about what happened in Oklahoma City? Why aren't we considering things like that? But I can tell you, and I don't want to get political here, but I can tell you, yes, there may be some bad government officials, but I've never met any government official at the senior national security level who doesn't take his or her job seriously, who's not very, very smart, who could make a lot more money in the private sector if they wanted to do that. And I have little patience for public officials who belittle what these women and men do. And I just read in the paper this morning where John Bolton, you may disagree with John Bolton, but the former national security advisor to the president, who's had death threats on him, the president just revoked his Secret Service protection.
The point I'm making is Clinton, it was during his watch, and he should have done something before.
Oh, yeah, well,
Before your president
yeah.
was in office. That's very
yeah, there was a lot, in the look back, the 9/11 Commission. There was a lot we should have done, and a lot of the issues dealt with the things like Robin asked me, and the diplomatic concerns about Saudi Arabia, I have a hard time with some of the things I hear proposed that we might be doing with Saudi Arabia under either the Biden administration or the Trump administration, knowing what I know about the aftermath of 9/11. Yes, ma'am.
Hi, good afternoon. My name's Lisa Silver. And I wasn't planning on perspective on the Saudi issue, which you shared when I asked questions. I happen to be the individual who handled a highly sensitive transaction to exit from Saudi after 9/11. And I literally sent the fax and wrote the public press release for Citigroup. And the answer is very simple. It was the reason that there was no action taken. It's called the dollar bill. And we knew because I got called, I got summoned, I was in Brazil, and I have a facility with handling things that not making a wake. So I was summoned back, and at the time, I was told the U.S. government was not going to be renewing the ambassador post, which was code for it's time to exit. So we had to unravel a 40-plus year relationship. I was, and I had said, I'm not the right person, I'm a female, they're probably gonna figure out I have some Jewish heritage somewhere. At the time I didn't use Milberg, because I would have had a target on my back for other reasons. But anyway, we got it done. I had some conditions that I get put up in the best hotel in London and all my expenses paid. And we got it done, and I literally wrote a one-line press release that Citi published, and there was no news, none, which was considered a success.
Yes.
Because nobody wants press, and it was, so we had no, and it was, we complied with the law perfectly, and we made money, and everything was fine, but it was a very sensitive situation. And it's public, so I can say it now. But I had two questions. I fully agree with you about the dual track justice system and the distraction that we get into with petty crime versus, major felonies, criminal, corporate fraud. I wanted to know if you had a reaction about the release of Leonard Peltier, and second, where you see things going with the current DOJ chief candidate out of Florida, who obviously is not part of the system, because my sense is, not having worked at DOJ, is that there is still this threat of, people go in and go out and learn the system and go into private practice and do other things. And despite the politics, and I understand the USAs do rotate and are political animals, there is still this, I would say, professionalism of being associated with that. And I don't know candidly what the history is of ever having anyone from completely outside the system. I think she'll be the first female too, right, ever?
No, Janet Reno.
Oh, Janet Reno,
Florida.
another Floridian,
Yeah.
right, Janet Reno, second Florida female. But if you have any perspective on kind of where we're going and what those two actions might
I don't know
mean.
anything about that case or the circumstances.
Leonard Peltier?
Yeah,
Do you know who he is?
not really. You have to refresh
Well,
my.
Leonard Peltier was, he's considered kind of a human rights hero. He was at Pine Ridge, and this was the early '70s case where the FBI came and was investigating, and two FBI officers got shot in the head. And, I think now there's been U.S. prosecutors who've said we kind of trumped up a case to frame Leonard Peltier.
I know about that
And
case.
he's been in Coleman prison for about 50 years, and there's been a lot of activism and artists.
I know.
Jackson Brown wrote a song about him.
Yes,
There's been a lot
yeah,
of
I
people
know.
who try to bring attention to this issue, and he was given clemency on at the end of the Biden term.
I don't know anything about that case. And the other, I didn't want to comment on the other matter.
The nomination, the current, the new.
Yeah,
AG.
I do not know.
Where do you see DOJ
I do
going?
not know her. You all may know her. She was your attorney general for a number of years. Pam Bondi.
Bundy.
Well, she was asking me, what do I know about the attorney general nominee?
Or where do you see DOJ going? Where do you see that? Because those two actions to me are significant, and I just wondered, just being a reader of the tea leaves and having a perspective.
Yeah. Well, I don't know where DOJ is going. Before the immunity decision, I could have given you a better answer to that question. But the immunity decision has clouded up the role of DOJ and the president. And so, because basically some of the things that I thought that President Trump would really be in trouble for when he denied what the Department of Justice had said were the factual circumstances surrounding the 2020 election, and try to force them to do some things in terms of calling out the marshals or shutting down election sites or calling out the U.S. attorneys to do certain things. I thought that would have really been problematic. The Chief Justice basically said that those actions cannot even be admitted into a trial, a criminal trial. So I don't know. I do talk about the norms in my book, because I think democracies, Churchill had that famous statement about it's a terrible form of government, but there's none better. And democracies are inherently fragile. And so a lot of the things that I grew up in the Department of Justice are basically norms, like lack of political interference with prosecutions, prosecutions going forward without undue influence. Those things are norms. Have presidents or other executive officials tried to do that in the past? Yes. Roosevelt actually tried to interfere with something Robert Jackson was doing, and Robert Jackson pushed him away. At the beginning of our country, some of the supporters of George Washington wanted George Washington to go to Edwin Randolph, our first attorney general, and ask him to do something. And Washington said, "I'm not going to get involved in it. I'm not a lawyer." So we've had some evidence of people trying to do this. These norms are now, they're not written down in the form of legislation. And a great deal of what we cherish as a society in terms of the rule of law, it's just norms that we've all accepted. Like we've all accepted certain norms as citizens. We don't spit on each other. We're polite generally. We don't push each other. These are norms, but if people start doing that, what happens to society? So to answer your question, I think there are a lot of terrific professionals in the Department of Justice, terrific and smart men and women. I hear mixed things about the nominee, Miss Bondi. I don't know her, but she's been a very successful prosecutor in this state, and I just hope for the best. She's going to have a tough time. She's got a tough client. Okay. And as lawyers, we've all had tough clients. And my mentor, by the way, I'll tell stories. My mentor is Griffin Bell, Jimmy Carter's Attorney General. And Judge Bell said, if you have a client that doesn't follow your advice, you fire the client. Or if you have a client that wants to interfere with the way you're conducting the case, then you leave. Get off the case. You know, I don't think I do think she's going to have a time when she'll have to make a decision to either do what somebody outside the Department of Justice wants her to do that may be improper, or just leave and resign. I guarantee you that's going to come up for her.
I have a question.
Question?
Yes.
Question back here.
Yes, Cheryl?
One more, then we probably should think about wrapping it up.
I wonder if you talk a little bit more about the, I'm gonna call it another court, the NSC court, a court that would deal with national security issues, and would you flesh that out a little?
Yeah, and it's tough for me to flesh out totally, Cheryl, because I don't have access to what's going on. But we need to think about all the situations where, I don't think a national security court would have to meet very often, but we do need to think about those times when there's a foreign actor, and I deliberately leave out domestic citizens, because I don't think it should apply to citizens. But there will come a time where we will have to do something quickly, and we don't have time to go through the criminal justice process, and we will need to have a way to get that done, to make certain we do it properly, and properly respect civil liberties, and properly protect the men and women, senior government officials who have to make these decisions.
Can I just ask a quick follow-up to that?
Yeah.
If one did that, would you have to change, would they be operating under the current laws, or would it require new, different laws?
You could probably do this under rules, CFRs, codes of federal regulations. You may have to have legislation. I just don't know enough. But we need to start thinking about it. That's the point. We have threats, and think about the kinds of things a single person could do. Dirty bombs are very sophisticated now. Somebody could just go into Wall Street, the Wall Street corridor, and ignite a nuclear bomb, a small, low-grade nuclear bomb, and cause great havoc to our financial system. And I think we're still vulnerable. That's the point. Okay,
Well, thank you.
And that's it.
Thank you all.
Sorry to be so glum.
Yeah,
I have some positive things in this book.
he does, and it's an excellent book. It is for sale down at the cash wrap downstairs. So if you don't have your copy yet, please purchase a copy, and I bet Larry will sign it for you.
I will.
Okay. Thank you. Thank you all for coming.
Thank you for reminding me about Judge Lambert.
My pleasure, because I was interested in that, right.
Yes,